The little gold statuette was cold in my hands, colder than anything had a right to be on a warm September afternoon. I had been holding it for 20 minutes, standing at my bedroom window, watching the black car pull up to the curb and the two figures emerge. One tall, willowy, wrapped in a beige coat that probably cost more than it should. One shorter, younger, with the restless energy of someone who didn't want to be here. My fingers had gone so tight around the statuette that my knuckles shone white through the skin, and behind my eyes there was nothing but frozen, burning hate. My father called from downstairs. His voice was gentle, the way it always was, that soft, unhurried warmth he had carried through every single day of my childhood. "Clara, come down. I want you to meet someone. This is Lena. Lena Morrow." The name tasted like ash in my mouth. In my last life, I had heard that name spoken with the same careful warmth, and I had believed it meant safety. I had believed my father had finally found someone to ease the loneliness my mother's death had carved into our home. I had been a fool, a naive, pampered fool who couldn't see the rot beneath the fresh paint until it was too late. I walked slowly down the staircase. Each step felt like a sentence being pronounced. The foyer opened up before me, afternoon light cutting through the tall windows and laying bright rectangles across the hardwood floor. Everything looked the same as it always had, the same family photographs on the wall, the same vase of fresh flowers on the console table, the same house I had grown up in. But nothing was the same. Nothing would ever be the same again. Lena and her daughter Chloe stood just inside the front door, still holding their coats, still wearing the careful, uncertain smiles of people who hadn't yet figured out how to stand in this house. The usurpers. The wolves in wool. My stepmother-to-be and her perfect, patient little heir. I could feel the weight of my first life pressing against the inside of my skull. I remembered the way Lena had slowly, meticulously, drained the warmth from this house. The way she had smiled at my father while accomplices picked his company apart piece by piece. The way he had died, crumpled on the pavement, his hands still clutching that strawberry milk candy, the candy he'd been reaching toward me when the world ended. That image was burned into my bones. It was the first thing I saw when I closed my eyes, the image that woke me gasping in the dark, and I knew it would be the last thing I saw when I died again. I stopped 3 steps from the bottom and smiled. Not my real smile. I wasn't sure I remembered how to do that anymore. This smile was a weapon, sharpened and polished and ready to cut. "Dad," I said, and I made my voice light, almost sweet, the voice of a girl who had never known betrayal. Why call her auntie? Wouldn't it be easier if I just called her mom right now? The air in the foyer went still. My father's expression flickered, confusion, then something sharper, something I didn't have time to read. Lena's smile froze on her face, a delicate, porcelain thing suddenly cracked. Chloe's jaw tightened, her eyes flashing with the first spark of a temper she was clearly struggling to control. Before anyone could speak, I stepped forward and pressed the gold statuette into Lena's hands. She flinched at the cold of it. I didn't let go until her fingers closed around the base, and I watched her face as the weight of it registered. It was heavier than it looked. I'd chosen it for that reason. "I picked this out especially for you," I said. The smile was still on my face. It felt like a wound that hadn't healed, like pressing on a bruise just to see how much it still hurt. "I heard you're very good at acting. This is for your show. I hope your ratings last forever, and that you live the rest of your life inside a script." Lena's face flickered. For one single second, something unreadable moved behind her eyes, something that might have been hurt, or might have been calculation, or might have been both. Then it was gone, smoothed over by that meek, endlessly gentle expression she wore like a second skin. I had seen that expression 1,000 times in my last life. I had believed it then. I would not believe it now. Clara, you're joking with me, she said softly. Her voice was warm, almost maternal, and that made it worse, because it sounded so genuine. I don't really understand all that. I just want to take good care of you and your father. A quiet life. That's all. Beside her, Chloe's jaw was tight. I could see the irritation coiling behind her eyes, the way she had to physically hold herself back, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. But her mother's glance cut sideways at her, a silent leash, the kind of look that carried years of unspoken authority, and she swallowed it down, her shoulders rigid with the effort. My father's face darkened. He let out a long, tired sigh that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. Clara, that's enough. I've spoiled you too much over the years. Lena, please don't take it to heart. She's still just a child. A child. I felt something twist in my chest, dull and deep, a knife turning slowly. In my last life, that same kindness, that same endless capacity for forgiveness, was exactly what killed him. It had been the door left open, the blind spot, the soft place where the knife went in. I had screamed at him, in those final months, that he was too weak, too trusting, too blind. And he had died anyway. And I had never gotten to tell him I was sorry. I pushed the hate down, pushed it so far down I could feel it pressing against my ribs like a caged animal, and kept my voice bright. Since Auntie wants to take care of us, cooking a meal shouldn't be too much to ask, right? I'd love something spicy. Sichuan boiled fish. Spicy chicken. I hope it's not too much trouble. I knew she couldn't eat spicy food. I knew it from my last life. It was a small cruelty, a needle thrust of pettiness, but I wanted to see her squirm. I wanted to see the mask slip, just for a moment. Chloe snapped. My mother isn't your housekeeper. And she can't eat spicy food. Clara, don't push it. I looked at her. The words came out flat and calm, the way a knife lies flat against a table before someone picks it up. That's exactly why she should cook. If you can't adapt, you're welcome to leave. No one's keeping you here. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Chloe opened her mouth, her eyes blazing with righteous fury, but Lena caught her daughter's arm. The gesture was gentle. Lena's gestures were always gentle, but I saw the pressure of her fingers, the way Chloe's mouth snapped shut like a trap. It's fine, Lena whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Everything's new. She's adjusting. I'll go cook. The perfect victim. In my last life, she had worn that role like a silk dress, always gentle, always understanding, always crouching low so the world would see how unfairly she was treated. And I had watched her do it, watched my father slowly bend toward her, watched our house become hers, watched the trap close around us both. My father's voice went hard. Clara Sutton. Go to your room. Now. I went. I walked up the stairs without looking back, my footsteps steady on the hardwood, my spine straight. I knew what was coming next, the same lecture, the same weary plea for me to grow up, to accept this new family. But what I didn't see, as I turned my back and walked away, was the look that crossed my father's face. It wasn't just disappointment. It was the look of a man who had already lived through a nightmare and was still living through it, right now, in silence. A man carrying a secret so heavy it pressed down on his shoulders and hollowed out his eyes. His hand, resting at his side, trembled, just slightly, just for a moment, and his mouth shaped something he could not yet say out loud. He watched me go, and his eyes were full of a grief too old and too deep to name. The bedroom door clicked shut behind me. No windows in this hallway. No escape from the sound of my father's voice, heavy with exhaustion, as he settled into the chair by my desk. The lamplight caught the gray at his temples, the lines around his eyes that hadn't been there a few years ago. Clara, you need to grow up. He paused, and something moved behind his eyes. Something I couldn't read. Something that flickered like a candle in a draft. Your mother passed away too young. I never remarried because I was afraid of making things harder for you. All these years, it's just been us. But Lena is a good, honest woman. She isn't after anything. She's not here to take what's ours. I took his hand. His fingers were warm and rough, the hands of a man who had built a company from nothing, who had worked weekends and late nights and never complained. The words I wanted to say were burning in my throat, a fire that had been burning since the moment I woke up in this second life. She's a liar. She's a snake. She's going to destroy you, and I watched it happen. I saw you die. I saw the blood on your hands and the candy you never got to give me. The candy was strawberry, Dad. My favorite. You remembered my favorite even at the end, and you never got to give it to me, But I had no proof. That was the cruel, impossible truth of it. Every horror I carried was a memory of a future that hadn't happened yet. In this world, in this present, Lena Morrow was nothing but a soft-spoken widow who had never once raised her voice. If I told my father the truth, that I had lived this all before, that I had watched him die, he would think grief had broken something inside me. And maybe it had. But that didn't make me wrong. So I stayed quiet. I swallowed the fire and let it burn a hole in my chest. I would wait. I would watch. I would gather proof, and when the time came, I would tear her mask off in front of everyone. This time, I would not fail. My phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a name, Cameron Vance. I let go of his hand. Dad, I have to take this. We'll talk later. I didn't look back. If I had, I would have seen my father lift the framed photograph from the dresser, the one of the three of us, the last family portrait before my mother was gone. I would have seen his thumb trace the edge of the glass, and his eyes go red, and his chest rise and fall with a grief too old and too deep to name. The photograph trembled in his grip, and for a long moment, he didn't move at all. Behind that grief was something else. A knowledge that had no words yet. A plan that had no shape yet. A secret that was mine too, though I didn't know it. The coffee shop was half empty, the late afternoon light slanting through the windows and pooling gold on the tabletops. The air smelled of roasted beans and steamed milk and something faintly sweet from the pastry case. I spotted Cameron near the back, at the same table where we'd had our first date, a tiny round table by the window, too small for 2 coffee cups and a plate of cookies. He'd laughed about it then. I could still hear that laugh if I concentrated. And for a moment, just a moment, I let myself hope. Cameron Vance. My intern-year boyfriend. Good-looking in an understated way, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and eyes that crinkled when he smiled. Sharp without being cruel, ambitious without being obvious. In my last life, my father had never approved of him. Unsteady, he'd said. Not reliable. He looks at you like you're a stepping stone, not a destination. I had spent that whole life trying to prove him wrong, trying to show him that I hadn't made a mistake, that I knew how to judge a person's heart. Walking toward him now, I felt that same stubborn hope flicker back to life. Maybe this time, I could get it right. Maybe Cameron was different. Maybe I could show my father that some people were worth believing in. I slid my arm through his, the gesture familiar and automatic. His sleeve was soft under my fingers. "Hey. What did you want to talk about?" He went rigid. Not the stiffening of surprise, but the freeze of someone who wanted to pull away and was calculating the politest way to do it. His arm, which should have relaxed into my touch, stayed hard and still. Then he pushed my arm off. Not gently. The motion was deliberate, almost clinical, like he was removing something unpleasant from his sleeve. "Clara. We're done." 8 words, flat and cold. No lead-up. No explanation. No apology. Just 8 words, delivered in the same tone he might use to cancel a subscription. Before I could speak, a woman's voice slid through the air behind me, sweet and cloying as cheap perfume. "Cameron said it's over. So, sis, maybe stop clinging." She walked toward us with the slow, deliberate confidence of someone who had already won. Silk dress, pale pink, flowing around her ankles, catching the light. Hair falling in careful waves around a face that was trained to look delicate. Celine's song. The office's favorite fragile flower, the woman who could summon tears on command and wield them like a weapon. In my last life, she'd wanted Cameron from the beginning. She'd circled him quietly, a patient little vulture, while my world fell apart around my ears. She'd whispered in his ear, stoked his ambition, pointed out all the ways I was holding him back. I'd been too buried in family chaos to fight her then, too consumed by my father's death to care about a man who had already shown me his true colors. And she'd slipped away clean, unscathed, her reputation intact. Not this time. "I'm talking to him," I said. My voice came out steady, which surprised me. Inside, something was cracking, something deep and structural. Outsiders don't get to interrupt. Celine's eyes went immediately glossy with tears. It was a talent, really, the way she could summon waterworks without any apparent effort, the way her lower lip trembled just enough to look vulnerable without looking ugly. She turned to Cameron, voice wobbling on cue. "I was just trying to help. Why is she so mean to me?" Cameron's face twisted with protective outrage. He stepped forward and pulled Celine close, his arm wrapping around her shoulders, his body angling itself between her and me like I was a physical threat. The look he aimed at me was pure disgust, the kind of look you'd give something you found on the bottom of your shoe. "Celine is a good person. Don't you dare bully her." Then he said the thing that finally, completely shattered whatever was left. "Clara, it's over between us. Celine and I belong together." Belong together, the words hit me like a physical blow, a fist to the sternum. I had loved this man. I had defended him to my father, had imagined a future with him, had believed, despite everything, that he was one of the good ones. And he was standing here, in front of me, with his arm around a woman who had spent months undermining me, telling me that they belonged together. Something inside me went very still. The last thread of hope, the one I had been holding onto since I woke up in this second life, snapped clean. I felt it go, felt the release of tension, and in its place came something cold and clear and utterly unforgiving. "Is that right?" I said. My voice was calm now, calmer than it had any right to be. "You belong together. Two people who chase money and stab backs. Is that the bond?" Cameron's face darkened. A vein pulsed at his temple. "Watch your mouth." I picked up my coffee cup. Lukewarm now. I'd been holding it for too long, waiting for a man who had already decided to leave. I looked at Cameron, then at Celine, and I let the silence stretch just long enough to watch them start to squirm. Celine's eyes darted to Cameron. Cameron's jaw tightened. Then I threw the coffee. It splashed across Cameron's shirt in a spreading brown stain, dripped down Celine's carefully chosen silk dress in rivulets, and for one beautiful, breathless moment, their composure shattered. Celine shrieked, a high, sharp sound that turned heads across the coffee shop. Cameron swore, stumbling backward, his hands flailing at his chest. "From now on," I said, setting the empty cup down on the table with a soft click, "we're even. You made your choices. Let's see where they take you." I walked out without looking back. The coffee shop door swung shut behind me, and the afternoon sun hit my face, warm and bright, and I kept walking. Behind me, I could feel their eyes on my back, and I let them look. Let them hate me. Let them underestimate me. They would learn. They would all learn. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of day that made the office fluorescence feel harsher than usual. I had barely settled into my chair, barely had time to pull up my email, when a thick stack of files slammed onto my desk with enough force to make my coffee mug jump. "Oh no," Celine said, not even trying to sound sincere. Her voice was pitched loud enough for the surrounding cubicles to hear. My hand slipped, "Sis." I looked at the files scattered across my desk like fallen leaves. Then I looked at Celine. She was standing over me, her arms crossed, her lips curved in a small, satisfied smile. She thought she had won. She thought the coffee shop had been a victory. She thought I would sit here and take this, the way I might have in another life. I stood up slowly. The movement made her take a half step back, involuntary, probably, but telling. I reached out and closed my fist around a handful of her long, silky hair. Her eyes went wide, her mouth opening in shock. I tugged, just hard enough to make her gasp, just hard enough to make her remember. "Funny," I said, my voice quiet and even. "Mine too." Her eyes went instantly watery, the tears welling up on cue like a trained actor hitting their mark. She glanced around the office, already calculating who was watching, who would feel sorry for her. That was her gift. The world always saw the tears, never the knife behind them. If she wanted a show, I'd give her one. I pulled out my phone. My fingers moved fast, navigating to the office group chat, the one everyone was in, the one where gossip traveled at the speed of light. Celine's eyes tracked the movement, and I saw the first flicker of real fear cross her face. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice losing some of its theatrical wobble. I hit send. Screenshots. Chat logs. Photos. Dates and times. Cameron and Celine, close together at a bar, his hand on her knee. Messages that left nothing to the imagination. The whole timeline of their quiet little betrayal, laid out in digital clarity for every single person in the office to see. The silence came first. Then the buzz, one phone after another, vibrating on desks across the floor. Faces turned toward Celine, expressions shifting from curiosity to distaste to open contempt. Someone let out a low whistle. Someone else laughed, a short, ugly sound. Celine's fragile flower act wilted in real time. She stood there, caught between fury and the desperate need to keep smiling, and the result was almost pitiful. Her face went through a series of micro-expressions, shock, rage, calculation, panic, and settled on something that looked like a mask that had cracked down the middle. That's when Cameron strode in. He came through the office doors like he owned the place, his shoulders back, his chin up. The confidence of a man who thought he was about to deliver a knockout blow. Celine's face transformed instantly. She melted toward him, small and wounded, her hand on his arm, her body language screaming, "Protect me." "Cameron." She breathed. He barely glanced at her. His eyes were fixed on me, burning with righteous fury. He slammed a contract onto my desk so hard the stapler jumped and clattered to the floor. The Dillian Group Partnership Proposal. His voice was loud, deliberately pitched for the whole floor to hear, the voice of a man performing for an audience. How did an intern get hold of this? Clara, did you forge a contract? Dillian Group. The industry's white whale. Top tier, nearly impossible to land, the kind of client that could make a career. Cameron had been chasing them for months, whining and dining their middle managers, sending gift baskets and follow-up emails and getting exactly nowhere. Of course, he couldn't believe I had it. His mind couldn't stretch that far. His ego wouldn't allow it. I met his eyes without blinking. I got it through proper channels. Just because your vision is small doesn't mean everyone else's is too. A muscle in his jaw jumped. His hands clenched at his sides. Don't get cute. You're coming with me to Mr. Feldman's office. Right now. We'll see what he thinks about your proper channels. Mr. Feldman's office was cramped and smelled faintly of stale coffee and old paper. The manager himself sat behind a desk cluttered with files and half-empty mugs, looking like a man who had been interrupted in the middle of something he'd rather be doing and resented every second of it. His glasses were pushed up on his forehead, and his tie was slightly crooked. Celine stood by the door, hands clasped in front of her, the picture of demure concern. Mr. Feldman, please go easy on her. Clara was probably just too eager to prove herself. You know how interns can be. Every word was a knife wrapped in silk. She wasn't defending me, she was planting the narrative. Asterisk eager intern. Overstepped. Probably forged something. Asterisk Cameron picked up the thread without missing a beat, pacing in front of the desk, his voice rising and falling with practiced indignation. This is a serious breach of protocol, he said. An intern, accessing Dillian Group materials. It's unheard of. I've been working that account for 6 months. And suddenly she waltzes in with a signed contract. I let them talk. I let them build the whole house of cards, brick by brick, lie by lie. Celine's voice, soft and poisonous. Cameron's voice, loud and righteous. They were a duet, perfectly synchronized. It would have been impressive if it weren't so transparent. When they finally ran out of steam, I spoke. Mr. Feldman, I said, my voice calm and measured, you can call Dillian Group directly. The contract is either real or it isn't. One phone call will settle it. He gave me a long look. Something flickered in his eyes. Curiosity, maybe, or the beginning of doubt. Then he picked up his phone. The call was brief. He spoke to someone, nodded a few times, made a note on a scrap of paper. Then he hung up and looked at me. His expression was unreadable. Their secretary said they don't know anything about this. Celine's face lit up. It was only for a fraction of a second, a flash of triumph that she quickly suppressed, but I saw it. I saw the way her shoulders relaxed, the way her mouth curved before she caught herself and rearranged her features into an expression of gentle disappointment. Mr. Feldman, she said, her voice dripping with fake concern, Clara was just overzealous. Please be lenient. I didn't flinch. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out a thick sheaf of papers, organized, tabbed with colored markers. I slid them across the desk. Before we settle the contract question, I'd like you to look at this. Financial summaries for the last quarter. Multiple expenditures don't align with records. Duplicate invoices, transfers without proper authorization. I also looked into Cameron's recent spending, luxury purchases, high-end restaurants, a new watch that costs more than his monthly salary. His spending is significantly out of alignment with his reported income. Cameron's face drained of color. It was almost comical, the way the blood fled his cheeks, leaving him pale and slack-jawed. "You're lying. You're an intern. You don't have access to financial records. This is corporate espionage. She's a spy, Mr. Feldman. It's obvious. Easier to accuse me than to open your own books," I said. The room was a coiled spring. Mr. Feldman looked from me to Cameron to Celine and back again, his forehead creased. No one spoke. The silence stretched, thin and taut as a wire. Then the glass door opened, and everything changed. The man who walked in was in his 50s, solidly built, wearing a charcoal gray suit that had been tailored somewhere expensive. He moved with the calm of someone who had never needed to raise his voice to be heard, someone who had spent decades in boardrooms and knew exactly how much power he held. Mr. Feldman scrambled to his feet so fast his chair rolled backward and hit the wall. "Mr. Quincy. Leonard Quincy. CEO of Dillion Group." His gaze swept the room, cool and unimpressed, taking in Cameron's pale face, Celine's frozen posture, Mr. Feldman's barely concealed panic. When he spoke, his voice was low and calm. "Internal squabbling. Malicious accusations. Financial irregularities. I have to say, the culture at this company doesn't inspire much confidence. If this is how you operate, the partnership is off the table." Mr. Feldman went pale. "Mr. Quincy, please, the partnership you mentioned." I stood up smoothly. The movement drew every eye in the room. I walked to the side table, picked up a glass of water, and crossed to Leonard Quincy like I was greeting an old family friend. Which, in a way, I was. "Uncle Len," I said, handing him the water. "You already signed the contract. No take-backs now." Mr. Feldman's mouth fell open. Cameron and Celine froze like two deer caught in the same headlights, their expressions identically stunned. I savored it, every second of their confusion, their dawning horror, the slow realization that they had made a very, very serious miscalculation. Leonard Quincy took the glass. His stern expression cracked, just slightly, the corner of his mouth twitching upward, the lines around his eyes deepening. He shook his head with something that looked almost like exasperated affection. "You knew I'd show up," he said. "You just wanted me to make an entrance." "My dad always told me," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Uncle Len is his best friend. If I ever got into trouble, Uncle Len would be my trump card." "Uncle Len." Cameron's voice came out strangled, barely a whisper. Leonard Quincy ignored him completely, as if Cameron were a piece of furniture that had made an unfortunate noise. He tapped my forehead lightly, the gesture almost paternal. "You've had a rough morning. I came to back you up. Now you've got it." The silence was absolute, the kind of silence that follows an explosion, when everyone is waiting to see what's left standing. I picked up my files and turned to Mr. Feldman, who looked like he'd swallowed a live fish. "About that financial audit I mentioned. Do you think it's a good idea?" He nodded so fast his glasses nearly flew off his face. "I'll arrange it immediately." "Actually," I said, and I let the pause stretch just long enough to be cruel, "I'll just hand it directly to my father. Oh, and I forgot to mention, my father is Edward Sutton, CEO of this company." The silence somehow got deeper. Cameron made a sound, something between a gasp and a groan, and slumped into a chair. Then, scrambling, his hand grabbed at the hem of my pants. "Clara." His voice was raw, desperate, stripped of all the arrogance from 5 minutes ago. It was the voice of a man watching his entire future collapse in real time. I was wrong. Please. I made a mistake. Help me. I looked down at him. He was on his knees, his shirt still stained from the coffee I'd thrown, his face contorted with fear and regret. There was nothing left in my chest for this man. No love. No hate. Just cold, clear clarity, the clarity of looking at a closed door and knowing you would never open it again. At the coffee shop, I said, when you chose to leave me for her, you should have thought about this. You wanted shortcuts. You wanted an easy ride. Now you pay the fare. You thought Celine was your ladder up. Her father's company is being acquired next month. You didn't just lose your girlfriend. You're about to lose your job. Then you'll face the auditors. I pulled my leg free. The motion was sharp, final. I turned to Celine, backed against the wall, her practiced softness gone, replaced by something sharp and cornered. Her eyes were dry now, no tears, no trembling lip. Just pure, undisguised fury. And you, I said. You're fired. Effective today. That's not fair, she spat. You're just riding on your family's name. Without your daddy, you're nothing. My family's name is my foundation, I said. It's not my crime. You build yourself on manipulation and shortcuts. You were never going to last. I pointed at both of them. From today forward, you'll be blacklisted. You won't find work in this industry again. Not in this city. Not anywhere. The breakfast table was quiet the next morning, but it wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was the quiet of a room full of people who had things they weren't saying. Silverware clicked against plates. Sunlight fell through the kitchen windows and lay across the table in long, clean rectangles. Chloe sat across from me, scrolling through her phone like I didn't exist. Grad school acceptance, I said, breaking the silence. You've been busy. She clicked her phone off and set it face down on the table. Just got in. Getting ready for the semester. Advanced degrees can be earned slowly, I said. Character can't. Her head snapped up. Her eyes were sharp, her jaw set. Clara, don't start with me. My father's voice cut through the room like a knife. It's barely morning. Why are you fighting with your sister again? Before I could answer, Chloe pushed her chair back with a scrape of wood on tile. I don't have a sister. And this is my home. I don't have to tiptoe around an outsider. I set my fork down with a deliberate clink. Outsider. Interesting choice of word. My father's face went red. It happened fast, too fast. The color rushed up from his neck to his cheeks, and then his expression changed. His eyes went unfocused. His hand, the one holding the coffee mug, started to shake. He swayed slightly, his other hand going to the edge of the table to steady himself. Chloe was at his side instantly, her earlier hostility vanishing in a heartbeat. Her arm went around his shoulders, steadying him. Mr. Sutton. Are you okay? Sit down. Here, sit down. From the kitchen, Lena hurried in. She had a pill bottle in one hand and a glass of water in the other, her face drawn with worry. Edward. Edward, your blood pressure. Here, take your medication. She pressed the pill into his hand, guided the glass to his lips. Her movements were gentle but efficient. She didn't panic. She didn't hesitate. It's my fault, Lena said quietly, as my father's breathing began to steady. I shouldn't have brought Chloe here. We've upset the balance of your home. I'm so sorry. I watched her hands tremble as she held the water glass, watched the genuine fear in her eyes as she looked at my father. A splinter of doubt worked its way under my skin. What if I was wrong? What if 2 lifetimes of hatred had blinded me to something simpler and more painful, that Lena Morrow was exactly what she appeared to be? My father's breathing steadied. The color returned to his face. He straightened up and turned to me. You need to respect your elders. You need to be kinder to your sister. I've told you this before. I sat through it. Then I went to my room. But I didn't go far. I stood in the hallway, just out of sight, and I listened. Through the wall, I heard my father's voice change, soften. I cracked the door open, just an inch, and saw him in the living room, holding a brand new laptop. For you, Chloe, he said. A gift. Congratulations on graduate school. Study hard. Then, quieter, Clara is stubborn. She's been through a lot. Please be patient with her. Lena stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Chloe took the laptop with a small, genuine smile, not the tight, guarded expression she usually wore around me, but something softer. The 3 of them stood there in a triangle of warmth that didn't include me. It felt like a knife. A slow, twisting knife, the kind that doesn't kill you right away but leaves you bleeding internally for hours. I'd been so sure Lena was scheming, so sure Chloe was complicit. But watching them now, I couldn't find the lie. I couldn't find the crack in the surface. Maybe there wasn't one. Or maybe the lie was so deep, so expertly constructed, that I couldn't see it yet. I didn't know which possibility scared me more. I left the house through the back door and walked until my legs ached. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of suburban quiet that feels like a held breath. I pulled out my phone and called Ivy, my best friend since high school, the one person I could still talk to without measuring every word. Ivy picked up on the second ring. Clara. You sound terrible. What's going on? I poured out everything, Lena, Chloe, the fight at breakfast, the way my father looked at them like they were his real family and I was the intruder. Ivy listened without interrupting, which was one of the reasons I loved her. That stepmother of yours, she said when I'd finished, her voice thoughtful. Going at her head-on is only going to make your dad defensive. You know how he is, he's a protector. The more you attack her, the more he'll feel like he has to defend her. You need to watch, wait, gather proof. Real proof, not just suspicions. Then strike once and make it count. I was about to answer when I passed a coffee shop and glanced through the window. The sight stopped me cold. My Uncle Harold was sitting in the corner. Harold Sutton, my father's younger brother. The man who'd practically raised me during the years my parents were building the company from nothing. I had spent half my childhood in his house, eating at his table, falling asleep on his couch while my aunt read me bedtime stories. He had taught me to ride a bike on the sidewalk outside his house, running alongside me with one hand on the seat, promising he wouldn't let go. He had come to every school play, every parent-teacher conference my parents were too busy to attend. He was family. The kind of family you never question. But something was off. Harold didn't like coffee. He was a tea drinker, had been his whole life, green tea specifically, the kind he imported and brewed in a special pot. I'd made him tea 100 times as a child, carefully measuring the leaves, waiting for the water to reach exactly the right temperature. He'd always said coffee was too bitter, too harsh, that it ruined your palate. Yet there he was, a cup of coffee in front of him, leaning across the table toward a man I didn't recognize. A man in a dark jacket, middle-aged, with a face that gave nothing away. They were talking in low voices, their heads close together. Harold's expression was tense, guarded, not the easy smile I'd grown up with. His shoulders were hunched, his movements quick and furtive. He looked like a man who didn't want to be seen. I hung up on Ivy without saying goodbye and walked inside. The coffee shop was warm, the air thick with the smell of espresso. Harold saw me the moment I walked through the door. His whole body twitched, a small movement, barely there, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't watching closely. But I was watching. I saw the way his hand jerked, nearly knocking over his coffee cup. I saw the way his eyes flicked to the man in the dark jacket and then back to me. I saw the way his expression shifted, smoothing over, the tension vanishing behind a mask of avuncular warmth. Clara. He stood up, arms open. What are you doing here? Just passing by. I slid into the chair across from him. The man in the dark jacket was closing his laptop, his movements unhurried but deliberate. Since when do you drink coffee, Uncle Harold? He glanced at his cup like he'd forgotten it was there. A beat too late, he said, tastes change. Getting old, I guess. He laughed, but it didn't reach his eyes. The man in the dark jacket stood up, nodded once at Harold, just once, a small, significant gesture, and left without a word. I looked at my uncle. The man who taught me to ride a bike. The man who'd come to every school play. The man who'd held me when I cried at my mother's funeral, his own eyes wet, his voice rough with grief. And I told him everything, about Lena, about Chloe, about the cold fear that something was wrong in our house and no one else could see it. Harold listened. His face was full of sympathy, his eyes soft with concern. When I finished, he reached across the table and put his hand over mine. His palm was warm, his grip reassuring. You've been through so much, he said. More than anyone should have to bear. Don't worry. Be patient. Gather evidence. Uncle Harold will always be on your side. Something in my chest unclenched. The tight, painful knot that had been there since I woke up in this second life loosened, just a little. I wasn't alone. I had my father, even if he didn't understand. I had Ivy. And I had my uncle. I left the coffee shop feeling lighter than I had in weeks. Behind me, through the window, Harold watched me walk away. His face changed as soon as I was out of sight. The warmth drained out of it like water from a sink, and in its place came something cold and calculating, something I had never seen on my uncle's face in 2 lifetimes. His mouth pressed into a thin line. His eyes went hard and flat. He pulled out his phone and typed a message, his thumbs moving quickly. Then he set the phone down, picked up his coffee cup, and took a long, slow sip. He still didn't like coffee. He never had. But there were a lot of things Harold Sutton had done in his life that he didn't like. My phone rang at 3 in the afternoon. Lena's name on the screen. I almost didn't answer. But something, some instinct I couldn't name, made me pick up. When I answered, she was crying. Not the delicate, controlled tears she usually deployed. These were raw, ugly sobs, the kind of crying that makes it hard to understand the words. Clara, Clara, I'm so sorry. I lost buttons. I didn't mean to. The door was open, and he just ran out. I've been looking for hours. I didn't want to tell you until I was sure, but I can't find him anywhere. The world stopped. Buttons. My corgi. 10 years old, with floppy ears and a stubby tail that wagged so hard his whole body shook. The dog who had slept at the foot of my bed through my mother's illness, his warm weight a comfort in the dark. The dog who had been there through every lonely night, every tear-soaked pillow, every moment when the silence of our too-big house threatened to swallow me whole. He wasn't a pet. He was my family. The only family member who had never disappointed me, never betrayed me, never made me feel like I didn't belong in my own home. In my last life, Lena had let him out on purpose. I remembered it with brutal clarity, the door left deliberately ajar, the 3-hour delay before she told me, the way she'd wrung her hands and apologized while I ran through the streets screaming his name. By the time we started looking, he was gone forever. I had never found him. I had never even found a body. I had swallowed my rage that time. I had chosen forgiveness, because my father had begged me to, because I was trying so hard to be the bigger person. That forgiveness had cost me everything. Not again. I ran home. I don't remember the journey, just a blur of streets and traffic lights and the pounding of my own heart in my ears. When I burst through the front door, my father was in the living room, his face heavy with exhaustion. "Clara, it was an accident. We'll find him." An accident? My voice came out raw, cracking. She opened the door on purpose. She waited 3 hours to tell me. 3 hours, Dad. In 3 hours, a dog can get anywhere. He could be dead by now. Lena stood in the corner, her back pressed against the wall like she was trying to disappear into it. Her eyes were red and swollen, her face blotchy from crying. She looked genuinely devastated. But I had seen her look devastated before, in my last life, and it had been an act. It had always been an act. "It's all my fault," she whispered. "I'll go look again." She rushed out the door into the night. Chloe followed a moment later, shooting me a look of pure venom. I stood by the gate, shivering in the cold. The night had turned sharp, the kind of autumn cold that gets into your bones. I scanned the dark street, my eyes straining for any sign of a small, stubby-legged dog. Hours passed. Time had gone strange and elastic, stretching and contracting around the fear in my chest. Finally, my father came back. He was supporting Lena on his arm, her weight leaning heavily against him. She was limping. Her pants were torn at the knee, and there was blood, real blood, dark and wet, staining the fabric. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears. Her hands were scraped and raw. Her arms were empty. "We looked everywhere," she said, her voice ragged, barely a whisper. "Every street, every alley, every backyard. I'm so sorry, Clara. I couldn't find him." Something inside me snapped. "You hurt yourself on purpose," I said, and my voice was ice. "You staged this. You fell into a ditch so you could come back looking like a martyr, so everyone would feel sorry for you." Chloe lunged forward, her face contorted with rage. "My mother spent hours searching for your stupid dog. She's bleeding. She twisted her ankle. Look at her hands. She crawled through bushes and climbed over fences and fell into a drainage ditch, and you're standing here accusing her of faking it." The shouting drew a crowd. Neighbors gathered at the edges of the yard, their faces half-lit by the street lamps. I could feel their eyes on me, could hear the whispers starting. Asterisk the Sutton girl. Always so difficult. Poor Lena, asterisk. My father stepped between us. He put his arm around my shoulders, pulling me back, and I braced myself for the lecture. I braced myself for him to take their side, to add his disappointment to the weight I was already carrying. Then I felt it. His fingers, against my shoulder blade. A tap. A pause. 2 taps. A longer pause. Then more taps, a sequence I hadn't felt in over a decade, Not since I was a child sitting on his lap during boring dinner parties, learning a secret language that was just ours. Morse code. The secret language we'd invented when I was 8 years old, tapping messages on each other's backs under the table, during long car rides, in moments when words were too dangerous or too loud. Asterisk MOLE, DUNTTRUST. IMLIKEYOU, asterisk. I stopped breathing. I looked up at my father's face. He was still wearing the expression of a weary, disappointed parent. His mouth was still set in that same long-suffering line. His brow was still furrowed with paternal frustration. Anyone watching would have seen exactly what they expected to see. But his eyes were full of fire. They held the same fury I carried, burning just beneath the surface. The same unspeakable grief, the kind that doesn't fade with time but digs deeper, carving channels through your soul. The same knowledge of a future that should never have happened, of a death that had already occurred, of a second chance that neither of us had expected. He had watched me die. He had held my hand while the life drained out of me. He had lost his home, his company, his daughter, everything he had ever built or loved. And he was here, right now, carrying that same impossible weight, holding it all behind a mask of tired fatherly concern. "Clara," he said out loud, his voice full of weary disappointment. "You need to grow up." But his fingers were still tapping against my back. Asterisk I'm with you. I've always been with you. We're going to finish this together, asterisk. The crowd dispersed slowly. Chloe took Lena inside to tend to her injuries, shooting me one last glare over her shoulder. My father and I waited until the last porch light had flicked off, until the street was quiet and dark. Then we walked to the underground garage and got into the car. The door closed with a solid thunk, sealing us into a bubble of silence and leather and the faint smell of his cologne. The overhead light was off. The only illumination came from the garage's fluorescent tubes, casting long, cold shadows. My father didn't start the engine. He just sat there, his hands on the steering wheel, staring through the windshield at nothing. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he turned to me, and his face crumpled. "In the last life," he said, and his voice was a broken thing, barely holding together at the seams, "I watched you die. I held your hand in the hospital. I watched the monitors go flat. I buried you next to your mother. And I couldn't do anything. I couldn't protect you. I couldn't protect our home. I failed you, Clara. I failed you in every way a father can fail." His arms came around me, and I fell into him the way I used to when I was small, before the world got complicated. The smell of him, tobacco and old wool and the faint citrus of his aftershave, was the same smell I'd known my whole life. It was the smell of safety. The smell of home. I cried. I cried in a way I hadn't allowed myself to cry since waking up in this second life. I cried for 2 lifetimes of pain, 2 lifetimes of watching each other die, 2 lifetimes of being so close and so utterly, devastatingly alone. I cried for the strawberry milk candy he'd never gotten to give me, for the words I'd never gotten to say, for the years we'd lost and the years we'd been given back. When I could speak again, I pulled back and wiped my face with my sleeve. My eyes felt swollen and raw. "Dad, why have you been so good to them? To Lena and Chloe? Have you forgotten what happened? Have you forgotten what they did to us?" His expression hardened. The grief was still there, underneath, but it was overlaid now with something colder, something sharper. "My kindness toward Lena and Chloe is an act," he said. "It's a performance, designed to throw off the person behind this." "What do you mean?" "Lena and Chloe are pawns, Clara. They were used, manipulated, just like we were. They have no idea what's really going on. They're innocent." He paused, letting the words settle. "They've been innocent the whole time." My mind reeled. "Then who killed you? Who killed us?" "Your Uncle Harold." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt the air leave my lungs. "Harold Sutton conspired with outsiders," my father said, his voice cold now, colder than I'd ever heard it. "He drained the company from the inside. He had me killed, and when you came after him, he had you killed too. The car that hit you, it wasn't an accident. It was arranged. Lena and Chloe were just a distraction, a wedge to drive us apart so he could operate in the shadows. Every fight you had with Lena, every moment of tension in this house, was exactly what Harold wanted. He's been counting on our family tearing itself apart." He pulled out his phone. "I did a prenuptial agreement before Lena moved in. All the family assets are secured in your name." She didn't object, not once. She never wanted any of it. She's been trying to hold this family together from the inside while I've been using her as cover. He showed me a video. Buttons, alive and well, tail wagging, chasing a tennis ball across a polished floor in a bright, clean room I didn't recognize. A woman's hand reached down to scratch behind his ears, and he flopped onto his back. "Buttons is fine," my father said. "I had him moved before Lena could lose him, not because I thought she would hurt him, but because I needed to see how you'd react. I needed you to see Lena's real character, not the version your hatred had built. And I needed Harold to think his plan was working." He swiped to photos. The man from the coffee shop, the one in the dark jacket, standing at the edge of the crowd during our argument, phone pressed to his ear. "Harold's man," my father said. "He's been surveilling us, feeding information back to your uncle. Every fight you had with Lena, every moment of tension, Harold knew about within hours. He's been waiting for the right moment to strike." The pieces clicked into place. Every suspicion I'd had about Lena, every bitter word I'd thrown at her, had been exactly what Harold wanted. I had been his weapon. My own pain had been his tool. The man who had taught me to ride a bike, who had held me at my mother's funeral, that man had been plotting our destruction the whole time. The horror of it settled over me like ice. "We're going to make him pay," my father said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of 2 lifetimes of betrayal. "But we have to be smart. We have to let him think he's winning until the moment we spring the trap." The next day, I called my uncle and asked him to meet me at the same coffee shop. I chose the location deliberately. I wanted him to feel comfortable. I wanted him to think he was in control, meeting his grieving, confused niece, the same girl who had poured her heart out to him just days before. The lighting was soft. Everything looked calm. The coffee shop was half full, the murmur of conversation providing gentle background noise. Harold sat across from me, stirring his coffee, his expression warm and concerned. "How's my favorite niece?" he said. "Uncle Harold, how's your wife doing?" "Fine. She's fine." His eyes flickered, just slightly. "Clara, the other day you mentioned your stepmother. You seemed very upset. Do you need my help? I could talk to your father. I could try to make him see reason." I remembered this. In my last life, I had poured out my grievances to him, and he had offered to help me deal with Lena. He'd suggested luring her to the company offices. Important documents had gone missing that same day. I had blamed Lena without hesitation. I had screamed at my father that his precious new wife was a corporate spy. I'd walked right into Harold's trap and helped him spring it. "I don't need help anymore," I said. He looked confused. What do you mean? When I was little, I thought your house was the warmest place in the world. The afternoons in your kitchen. The way you taught me to ride a bike, running alongside me, promising you wouldn't let go. You were the family I trusted most. More than anyone except my dad. I slid a folder across the table. So tell me, Uncle Harold. As my father's brother. As the relative I trusted more than anyone. When did you start plotting against us? His face went blank. All the warmth, all the avuncular affection, all the carefully constructed performance of 2 decades, it vanished like a light switching off. What was left was something cold and hard, a face I had never seen before, a stranger wearing my uncle's skin. Then my father walked in. He came through the coffee shop door quietly, without fanfare. He wasn't wearing a suit, just a simple sweater and slacks. But there was something in the way he moved, something in the set of his shoulders, that made him look taller than he was. The 2 brothers faced each other across the small table. The silence between them was heavier than stone. I could feel it pressing down on my chest. Harold let out a laugh. It started low and built, a wild, ugly, unhinged sound that turned heads across the coffee shop. His eyes were full of years of rot, decades of jealousy, of watching his older brother succeed while he struggled. Brother, he spat. The great Edward Sutton. You had everything. The company. The fortune. The perfect little family. And what did I have? Debt. Failure. A business that never took off. While I drowned, you threw me scraps and called it generosity. The resources you handed me were worthless. You never wanted to help me. Not really. My father's voice, when he spoke, was heavy with sorrow. Not anger. Sorrow. The sorrow of a man who had loved his brother and was only now realizing how deeply that love had been betrayed. I never held back, he said. I paid off every debt you had. Every single one. The loan from the bank. The second mortgage on your house. The credit cards your wife didn't know about. I paid them all, Harold. I never told you because I didn't want you to feel small. He placed another folder on the table. Receipts. Bank transfers. Years of money, quietly moved, quietly erased. The paper trail of a brother who had been saving his sibling from ruin without ever asking for thanks. Harold stared at the papers. His face went gray, literally gray, the color draining from it. The fury drained out of him, and in its place came something worse, the realization that he had destroyed himself over nothing. That the betrayal, the murder, the years of scheming and plotting and hating, all of it had been for a debt that was already paid. For a rescue that had already happened. He slumped in his chair. He seemed to shrink, to collapse inward. Tears slid down his face, real tears. I didn't know, he whispered. I didn't know you paid them. Why didn't you tell me? Because you were my brother, my father said. And I loved you. The police arrived. They came in quietly, professionally, and led Harold away. He didn't resist. At the door, he turned back and looked at me. Clara, he said, his voice hoarse, barely audible. I never wanted to hurt you. Whatever else you believe that. You were the one good thing. He swallowed hard. I still don't like coffee. My whole life, the only thing I really loved was the tea you used to make for me when you were little. Do you remember? Green tea, in the special pot. You always got the temperature just right. Then he was gone. The coffee shop was quiet again. My father and I sat in silence, the empty folders spread across the table between us. "It's not over," he said quietly. His voice was tired but alert. "Harold's words suggest there's still someone else. Leonard Quincy found something. The person who orchestrated everything, who pulled the strings behind Harold, who set the whole tragedy in motion in our last life, has been identified." I felt my heart clench. "Who?" "I'll tell you at the family dinner this Sunday." Sunday came with a clarity that felt almost cruel. The sky was a perfect, cloudless blue. The house was full of the smell of cooking, roast chicken, fresh bread, something with cinnamon. It smelled like the Thanksgivings of my childhood, before everything went wrong. Lena approached me quietly in the hallway. She was holding a white dress, simple and elegant. Her hands were trembling slightly, and her eyes held the uncertainty of someone who wasn't sure if her gift would be accepted or thrown back in her face. "I thought this might suit you," she said. "For the dinner. You don't have to wear it. I just saw it and thought of you." I looked at her, at the gentleness in her eyes, the scrapes still visible on her hands from the night she'd spent searching for a dog that was never lost. I thought of all the times I had snapped at her, all the cruelty I had aimed her way. The guilt rose in my throat, thick and choking. "Thank you, Lena," I said. "And I'm sorry. For everything. For the way I've treated you. You didn't deserve any of it." Her eyes glistened. She squeezed my hand and didn't let go for a moment. "You don't have to apologize. You were protecting your family." Then the door opened. Chloe walked in, her arm linked through the arm of a man I recognized immediately. Cameron Vance. He was dressed well, too well for a man who was supposed to be in hiding. A dark suit, a crisp white shirt, his hair carefully styled. He walked into my living room like he belonged there, his chin up, his shoulders back, the smug confidence of a predator who thought he'd found safe ground. I went cold. Cameron, who should have been hiding from the police. Cameron, who was under investigation for embezzlement and fraud. Cameron, standing in my living room, introduced by Chloe as her boyfriend. Lena, innocent and warm as always, welcomed him like a future son-in-law. She had no idea who he was, what he'd done. My father's face was unreadable, the mask of the weary patriarch, firmly in place. At dinner, the tension was a living thing, coiling around the table like a serpent. The food was beautiful, Lena had outdone herself, but I could barely taste it. Every bite felt like ash. My father, calm and deliberate, picked up a piece of shrimp and placed it on Cameron's plate. The gesture was almost paternal. "Mr. Vance, where do you work these days?" Cameron smiled, smooth and rehearsed, the smile of a man who had been practicing in front of a mirror. "I'm currently at Aura Corporation. I'm here today to ask for Chloe's hand." "I don't approve." Cameron's smile didn't flicker. He'd been expecting this. "You might want to reconsider, Mr. Sutton. Chloe is pregnant with my child." The table went silent. Lena's face drained of color. My father's hands clenched on the table. Then Chloe leaned into Cameron's shoulder, her body language soft, her voice sweet, sweeter than I'd ever heard it. "Honey, if you want to marry me, the bride price is $100,000. Do you have it?" Cameron blinked. $100,000. That's insane. And a house. At least 3,000 square feet. 2 cars. Adequate savings. "I have standards, darling." "Chloe," Cameron said, his voice hardening, "you're pregnant out of wedlock. You're in no position to make demands. No one else is going to marry you. You should be grateful I'm willing to step up." The room held its breath. Then Chloe's hand swung. The slap cracked across Cameron's face like a gunshot. It was a full-arm swing, no holding back, and the sound of it echoed off the dining room walls. Cameron's head snapped to the side, his hand flying to his cheek, his eyes wide with shock. Every trace of softness vanished from Chloe's expression. She stood over him, her eyes blazing, her voice cold and sharp as a blade. "You bullied my sister. You cheated on her. You tried to destroy her career. And now you think you can manipulate me. You think you can waltz in here and blackmail me into marriage. You're even more pathetic than I thought." Cameron's hand was pressed to his reddening cheek, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. You. Chloe pulled out her phone and held it up. A medical report, clear and damning, displayed on the screen. "Pregnant. I had acute gastritis. Bad sushi. I made up the pregnancy story just to see what you'd do. And you walked right into it, you arrogant, scheming bastard." Cameron's face went pale. The blood drained from it so fast I thought he might faint. And here's something else. The audit results came back weeks ago. Embezzlement. Fraud. Misappropriation of company funds. The police have been looking for you. We just needed you to surface. Cameron scrambled backward, his chair tipping over with a crash. He stumbled, his composure shattering completely. He dropped to his knees, grasping at the hem of my dress like a drowning man reaching for a lifeline. Clara, I was wrong. It was all Celine. She manipulated me. She wanted to steal company secrets. She wanted to sell them to a competitor. She even talked about staging a car accident, making it look like a hit and run, something that couldn't be traced. She said you were the only obstacle. It was her idea, all of it. I just went along with it. Please, Clara, you have to believe me. There it was. The final piece. The confession I've been waiting for across 2 lifetimes. In my last life, Cameron's greed and Celine's malice had worked together, with Harold's help, to destroy my father and end my life. The car that had hit me, it hadn't been random. Celine had planned it, Cameron had known, and Harold had provided the resources. This time, every thread had unraveled. Actions have consequences, I said. My voice was steady, but inside I was shaking with the overwhelming weight of a justice 2 lifetimes in the making. No exceptions. Outside, sirens wailed. The police had been waiting. Cameron was taken away in handcuffs, still babbling, still begging, still trying to blame everyone but himself. Across town, Celine was arrested in her rented apartment, her fragile flower act finally, permanently dismantled. The house settled into quiet. The dining room was a wreck, overturned chairs, scattered silverware, the remains of a dinner no one had finished. But no one seemed to care. My father stood by the window, watching the police cars pull away. Lena sat at the table, her face a mixture of shock and dawning understanding. Chloe leaned against the wall, a fierce, satisfied smile playing at the corners of her mouth. I looked at my father. Did you know about Cameron and Chloe? He shook his head slowly. Not until recently. Chloe came to me a few days ago and told me she suspected her new boyfriend wasn't who he claimed to be. She asked me to run a background check. The report came back yesterday. We decided to let him hang himself. I turned to Chloe. You knew. The whole time. She shrugged, but her eyes were sharp. I knew he was a liar. I knew he'd hurt you. I wanted to see how far he'd go. And I wanted to be the one to take him down. Her voice softened, just slightly. No one messes with my family. Chloe pushed off from the wall and walked over to me. She put her arm around my shoulders, the same gesture my father had used days ago, to tap a secret message into my back. From now on, she said, her voice light but carrying an undercurrent of fierce protectiveness, no one messes with you. You've got a sister now. Sister, that one word, which had felt like an insult days ago, which I had spat out like poison, now settled over me like a shield. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not an enemy, not a rival, but someone who had been trying, in her own prickly way, to find her place in this strange, fractured family. Thank you, I said. She rolled her eyes, but she was smiling. Don't get sappy on me. I looked around the room. Lena was smiling softly, her eyes still red-rimmed from the evening's chaos but full of warmth. She caught my eye and nodded, just once, a small gesture that said more than words could. My father was watching us with an expression I hadn't seen in years. Not across 2 lifetimes. Peace. And Buttons, my sweet, ridiculous, stubby-legged corgi, was curled at my feet, his tail thumping lazily against the floor, utterly oblivious to the drama that had just unfolded. He looked up at me with his big, dark eyes, and I bent down to scratch behind his ears. Hey, boy, I whispered. I missed you. His tail wagged harder. Sunlight poured through the windows. Golden and clean. The kind of light that feels like a promise, like a door opening, like the first day of something new. It fell across the scattered silverware and the overturned chairs, across Lena's tired smile and Chloe's defiant posture, across my father's weathered face and Button's happy, panting grin. 2 lifetimes of pain. 2 lifetimes of being blinded by rage, of mistaking the innocent for the guilty, of nearly destroying the people who had been trying to love me all along. 2 lifetimes of fighting shadows while the real enemy stood in the light, smiling, calling himself family. I had thought I was walking through the darkness alone. But my father had been there the whole time, carrying the same nightmare, holding the same secret, waiting for the moment we could finally stand together and face the truth. Those who had hidden their malice beneath kindness, Harold, with his warm hugs and patient advice, and those who had hidden their kindness beneath patience, Lena, with her quiet endurance, Chloe, with her prickly defensiveness, all of them were finally seen. The masks were off. The dead were at rest. The living could finally begin to heal. I am no longer the reckless, bitter girl who raged against shadows. I am no longer the daughter who mistook her father's wisdom for weakness. I am no longer the woman who pushed away everyone who tried to love her, too afraid of betrayal to accept the possibility of loyalty. I have my father, who walked through death itself to stand beside me. I have my stepmother, who endured my cruelty without complaint because she understood, in ways I'm only beginning to grasp, what it means to lose everything and start again. I have my sister, sharp-tongued, fierce-hearted, and unexpectedly loyal. I have my dog, who has loved me unconditionally through 2 lifetimes and will never know how close he came to being a weapon in someone else's war. The world's cruelties are behind us now. Not because the world has changed, the world is still full of Harolds and Camerons and Celines, still full of people who will smile while they sharpen their knives. But because we have changed. We have learned to see through the masks. We have learned to trust the people who earned it. We have learned that family is not a matter of blood but of choice, of the quiet, stubborn decision to stand together when standing apart would be easier. The years ahead are steady. The years ahead are safe. And they are ours.